So thanks very much, Mark, for participating in our project. I suppose to start, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm, I suppose, 57 years of age and around 3 years from retirement, and I would have joined ESB very early in January 3rd or 4th, 1979. Primarily, I have an IT background, so I studied computer science at night in Trinity while I was working during the day in ESB. So that's me. I've happily married, thank God, with Catherine, my wife, and 2 children. A son, Ian, who's married and working in Silicon Valley, also did computer science in Trinity, and is meant to look just like me, so God help him for that. And also then a daughter is 21, and she's in DCU doing accounting and finance and playing basketball. So that's my story.
So can you tell me a little bit about your current position in the company?
Well, at the moment I'm working as the IT systems manager for ESB eCards. So that means I'm responsible for the IT that supports the infrastructure out in the field, the charge point management system, which controls the physical chargers, and also the solution design around customer relationship management and billing. So how we would charge for the using the chargers in the UK, where we're doing business for Transport for London at the moment, and I have a small team who are mainly IT and telecommunications people.
So can you tell me a little bit more about the other types of roles that you've had within the company?
Well, I've had many roles in the company, but mostly, I'd say, not straying very far from the computer or telecommunications background. So previous to this job, I worked as Chief Technology Officer for ESB, which would have involved looking at the overall enterprise architecture of ESB from an IT and telecommunications point of view, and having monthly sessions with the various business unit IT managers to discuss issues and plans, so what we wanted to do in the future and how we felt about what we were doing at the moment and things that needed to be addressed. And then prior to that, I was the manager of IT audit for ESB, so I would have been in charge of looking at all of the systems in ESB and seeing how they stood up from a security and stability point of view, and from the point of view of user functionality and value for money. And prior to that, I was the application development manager for ESB, and prior to that, the controller of systems programming for ESB. And then right back through to systems analysis and programming, which brings me right back to the very start of my time in ESB. So I would have joined ESB as an executive officer in, as I said, early June 1979. I had worked in Hibernian Insurance in Dublin for nearly a year, and had applied for the EO in the civil service and the EO in ESB, and I got both jobs, and then my dad told me to take the EO in ESB because it was more dynamic, and he was right. It was more interesting.
So what was your favourite role or your most challenging role throughout your career?
I think politically challenging would have been the Chief Technology Officer role, because you're trying to satisfy so many different business units and work with so many different business units who had different priorities in terms of IT. Technically challenging, I would say, controller of systems programming, because the entire country live online systems in terms of being able to respond to customer queries would have depended on this system, and if it went offline or if the response times went above 2 or 3 seconds, things would start going wrong in the call centres. So that's a lot of kind of day-to-day challenge to make sure you're tuning the system properly, and also tuning the system carefully, because any change you make to software has a certain risk associated with it as well. So it was a very interesting period. I don't know. I think I think that would be a young people's game. I wouldn't like to be doing that job again.
So what do you feel then has been your greatest achievement in ESB?
I would say probably, again, the greatest technical achievement was one Wednesday afternoon. We noticed that that we appeared to be getting what they call head crashes, which is when the large disks that we had in those days started getting hardware errors on them, and then we lost several databases, including the customer billing database, and we had to recover from the previous night's backup on log tape. And I mean, we had been in as a normal day at 8:30 that morning working away. This happened about 4:30, and we started the recovery then at 4:30 and had to, take back the database as it was the previous night, and then apply all of the transactions from logs that had taken place during the day. And that's a very, very, very delicate process, and we were there right through until 6:30, 7 o'clock the following morning. But by 8 o'clock the following morning, the system was back. So there were 3 of us involved, and we all went home to bed at that stage. But in fact, as far as the company was concerned, there wasn't any significant kind of loss of the system, even though we were putting it together literally from fragments. So that would have been the greatest technical achievement. And I remember our head of IT at the time, Paddy Kelly, was just, he was just overjoyed that we'd managed to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I'd say the biggest personal achievement was around the time when the Berlin Wall came down. ESB International were doing a lot of work around the place, and the European Investment Bank then decided to invest a fair bit of money in Central and Eastern European utilities to try and bring them up to European standards. And so, wearing the SBI jersey and working largely for a guy called Mick Lee, I went around acting as a consultant and solution designer for ESBI around several parts of Central Europe, and Lithuania, Latvia, and Czech Republic, and Slovakia, Hungary, and Croatia. It was just very interesting, personally challenging, and very interesting, because literally they were just coming out from, essentially not having a democratic situation, and being in very difficult circumstances, and they were just so enthusiastic about getting up to kind of Western standards. So it was really, really interesting.
Okay. So what does ESB mean to you?
Well, ESB is essentially a kind of a big part of my life, so if you consider 1/3 is work, 1/3 is family, and 1/3 is sleeping, if you're, hopefully. So it's essentially a huge part of your life, and family to some extent. I mean, there are many people working now in ESB, and many people who have since retired, who I would be in regular touch with, and would meet socially, either on my own or with Catherine. And it's just a very, very big part of your life. And ESB traditionally has always tried to do the right thing for people. It's always been a good employer. So it really means a lot.
So in what ways do you feel that ESB has contributed to Irish society?
Well, again, I mean, ESB is a huge organisation in Irish terms, even though we're a relatively small energy company in European terms or in GB terms. But as a large company in Irish terms, I think between ESB and ESB International, we've kind of punched above our weight for Ireland, and I think the company has been very competent in what it's done, and it's been very ethical in what it's done. I mean, one of the things about ESB abroad as ESBI is we get a very, very large number of follow-on business, because ESB is recognised as the type of company that genuinely works with people and does skills transfer. We don't want to keep all of our knowledge, under the covers. There's genuine skills transfer goes on, and people feel that they really have learned something from a consultancy from ESB and they want more. So that's the type of company ESB is, and I think that's a great achievement really for a company to be able to say that, and to behave in an ethical way. You know, we've operated in a number of countries with very, very different kind of socio-political kind of backgrounds, and we have never had any difficulties. We always fit in, you know. So we've operated in, you know, Pakistan and various parts of Africa and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Europe, and you know, there's never been, you know, an issue. Even though some of those countries that we've operated in might have had problems with each other, they've never had problems with ESB. So I think that's a great statement of integrity.
And how do you feel that the history of the company informs the values of the company, or even how should it inform the company going forward?
Well, I think it's a key piece of value that the ESB should cherish. You know, I'd be very sad to see ESB become purely a kind of a nuts and bolts, cost-driven company, and hopefully that won't happen. I know that we do have to, in a competitive environment we're in now with retail market opening and ISM and all the rest of it, we do have a lot of challenges, and we have to tackle our cost base and the loss of revenue at the generating stations, and there's a lot of difficult decisions that will have to be made, but I would hope that they would be made in the most fair and reasonable possible way, and people are treated properly, because that's a key hallmark of ESB. In the mid-80s we had a chief executive called Paddy Moriarty, and I met him several times because I was, you know, obviously working very much growing in the IT scene, and Paddy had a great interest in IT, and he was a great fan of a guy called Jan Carlson, who was the head of SAS at the time, and Jan Carlson had written a book called Moments of Truth, where he kind of more or less empowered his people to look after the customer and look after each other. And Paddy came out with this memo to all the company, would have been an email today, but memo to all the company, basically saying, you know, when you're in a customer situation, just do the right thing and we won't second guess you. And that was kind of a revolutionary thing to say at the time. I mean, that was way ahead of its time. And so that's what ESB was in those days. It was just very competent and very caring, and to be looking at customers in that way was kind of way ahead of its time.
So what are the biggest changes that you've seen ESB undergo in your time here?
Well, obviously we've had challenges. We've had retail market opening, and we have ISM coming along now, and you know, we've had to lose, under regulation, we've had to use market share. So it's very difficult in Ireland. I mean, our numbers have gone down of staff from 12,500 to just a little under 7,000 people, and even though it will go up again now with ESB International and various bits of work we're doing in GB, hopefully. There are great opportunities available in GB. Even to get kind of 5, 7, 10% of a huge market like that would be very, very profitable for ESB. So there are enormous changes going on. Then in the energy business itself, there's cogeneration, there is distributed generation, and there's so many different things going on in the energy business that you wouldn't recognize it from 20 years ago, and I'd say in even as little as 10 years' time it'll be unrecognizable again. So those pose very big challenges.
And how well equipped do you feel that ESB is to address those challenges, or the opportunities that might arise as well?
Well, I think change can be quite difficult for ESB. ESB is still a bit of a super tanker when it decides to do something, say, you know, like Money Point in in the early 80s, or like safety now in the last few years. It does it really, really well, but when it wants to do something quickly or in an agile fashion, it can be quite difficult. Sometimes to get all of the approvals you need, and all of the legal approval and financial approval and procurement approval, you do feel, when you're trying to innovate, you do feel like you're swimming through treacle, that you're dealing with, you're still dealing with a traditional utility company, whereas to respond to some of these challenges, we need to behave a little differently and react a little bit more quickly. So I think that's something that's going to have to be addressed in the current reorganisation, and hopefully that's what we'll do.
Is there anyone in particular that you feel has influenced you most throughout your career in the company?
Yeah, well, I suppose a few different people. Paddy McArty, as I said, was a great, very charismatic character. In terms of my career, there was a guy a couple of years older than me called Vivian Young, who again joined the company without a primary degree, and we would have been surrounded by people with engineering degrees and business degrees and all the rest of it. And he was very interested in computers as well, and had started doing the computer science degree, 4-year computer science degree in Trinity at night. So I followed him in down that route, and very, very happy that I did. I mean, we were working full time, and then doing lectures on Mondays, Tuesdays and Thursday nights, and then doing programming in college on Saturday mornings. So in addition to, so it wasn't great fun at the time, but it really was very intensive, but very, very good, because coming out the other end of it, you're right on the cusp of the IT boom, and so I'd say he was probably the most influential person from a career point of view.
Right. So moving on now to head office in particular, do you have any particularly fond or favourite memories of head office?
I have loads of great memories of head office, but most of them couldn't be spoken about. Yeah, well, the head office when I started was a very young place in many ways. I started in payroll and expenses section with Alfie Sexton, Eden Cosgrove, and all of that gang. Francis Langan, and so it was a very, very, very interesting place. The only person who's still there now is Therese Farrell, who's probably the only person who's been in salaries and expenses, the longest of all, but she really knows everything about the place. But it was a very efficient section, because obviously all of the staff in the company had a great interest in the efficient operation of payroll and expenses. But it was a great place to get to know the company as well, because you get to know all of the sections and deal with all of the different divisions. And I've very fond memories of that. And then when I moved into operations and went on shift operations, so working either from 8 to 4 or 4 to 12, it was just very, very interesting environment as well. And we had a lot of young programmers, male and female programmers, and then we had the data preparation unit preparing all of the data for input into the computer. So we had a great social scene going, and worked very hard, and then out on the tower on a Friday evening, and it was just great fun. I know a lot of people would have found the 80s difficult, and some of my friends would have had to move over to New York and stuff like that to get jobs. But we genuinely felt very lucky to be in ESB.
And what was your first impression of the building?
Oh, my first impression of the building was, who designed this thing? And so I reported into A block, as you did then. It was the reception area, and then I was taken through a kind of a rabbit warren of corridors into B block, which is where payroll and expenses section was. When I moved into computer division, I was down the basement of that block, but a lot of the technical services, the engineering computing was in C block, which is an even older building. D block hadn't been built at that stage, and E block, which is really just an atrium linking all of the Georgian buildings, hadn't been completed at that stage. But it was really kind of a topsy kind of place, you know. There were none of the floor levels actually were at the same level. So A block was at a different level to B block, and a different level to C block. You know, it was just wild. We had young students coming in for the summer, and they'd be lost in there for days. You'd have to send in search parties and all. I'm slightly exaggerating, but they would actually get lost, and they would have to find they'd have to find a phone. No mobiles, of course, no. They'd have to find a phone and ring your extension, and you'd have to try and figure out from what they were saying where in the building they might be, and try and direct them. It was like a maze. Direct them back out. The same for consultants. If you didn't pick up a consultant at the front desk, they mightn't get to you. So it was really one of those buildings, and of course the front was a big controversial issue with the Georgian houses. I met Sam Stevenson on a different issue in broadband over Powerline in the early noughties, and he was actually came across as a very nice guy, not the butcher of Georgian Dublin, but I mean, I think that was a terrible thing. I mean, we didn't know, I don't know, people weren't aware, I suppose, of heritage as they are now, and hopefully this new development will, you know, make amends for some of that, you know, make it fit in better with the Georgian architecture. But that's head office, it was just, you know, it was, nobody actually designed it, it just kind of evolved.
So a lot of people have mentioned the canteen. Do you have any favourite memories around that?
Well, the canteen was great. I mean, it was a good canteen, and the staff were extremely friendly, and then you had, it was like a big school thing where you had little dips on the table to fit your tray and all the rest of it. It was like being maybe being at a boarding school. Not that I was at a boarding school, but what I imagine a boarding school might be. But it was a good place for, you know, they would have, you know, Christmas there would be a party up there, and a choir to sing a few tunes and all the rest of it. So it was a great kind of social area at lunchtime, and, you know, grand spot. They had another canteen at the end of the canteen called the Fitzwilliam, and if you had senior suppliers or clients or customers in, you could book that, and that was really quite a good restaurant, you know. It was like the ESB version of bringing somebody out for lunch, you know, but actually the food was fantastic.
You touched on it there a moment ago, but I suppose, how do you feel about Project Fitzwilliam, or even the move to Gateway and all that's involved?
Well, the move to Gateway is just necessary. I mean, we had to move somewhere. Luckily, I'm a Northsider, so I probably did okay out of it. It's going to reduce my commute by about 20 minutes, but other people, it's obviously increased their commute by 20 minutes, and they'll be counting the days until they get back into the revamped Fitzwilliam. No, I think it's great. I mean, I think a building reaches a stage where it's way overdue to be totally redone, and I think I've seen some of the plans and elevations. I don't know the interior details, but it looks like something that fits much better in with the landscape, and kind of connects between Fitzwilliam Street and the Bank of Ireland as well, with that kind of area. So I think it could be very good.
So what do you hope then that your oral history NGP will offer future ESB staff or archives researchers?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think kind of oral history, while, you know, people are still around and still remember all of these things that happened not so long ago, It's a great way of capturing stuff and what did happen, the way things actually were. It's just a great treasure time capsule to have, and for people to look at later on, in 20 or 30 years time, and things will have changed a huge amount, and social sensitivities would have changed as well. I remember one of my fellow wheelchair users, Niall O'Hanlon, when I first came into ESB, or rather when my sister-in-law first came into ESB, and she was shown into the customer accounting area. She was, I've Niall's permission to tell this story, she was shown into the room and she saw Niall, and Niall was sitting in a filing cabinet, filing the filing in the other cabinet, because that was the easiest way to do it. In this day and age, there would be so many, and rightfully so, there'd be so many equality and health and safety issues. So it's funny the way society kind of moves on. It's just incredible. That was society at the time. There was no kind of, it was before my accident occurred about halfway through my career. But at that stage in the 80s, there was no great, acknowledgement of the rights of any of the many minorities. And I think in many ways the Ireland we live in now is a much better place than it was then. But it's absolutely no harm to remember all of the good stuff and the bad stuff.
Yeah. So what role then do you think that ESB Archives has in the future of the company?
Well, I think when it's run like it's run now with enthusiasm, I think it's a great resource for the company. The company has such a rich history, and it would be an awful shame not to capture it and have it there for future generations to see. I mean, it's apart from being a rich resource for ESB staff and future ESB staff and pensioners, it's a huge resource for the country, because ESB is such a central part of Irish society. So I think it's just very important.
So is there anything that I should have asked you, or anything that you'd like to add now before we finish up?
No, I think we covered everything.
Great.
Pretty well. I can't think of anything.
Well, thanks very much.
No problem.
Thank you.